The day my son Marcus called me human garbage in front of his fiance's entire family, I knew something had to change. What he didn't know was that this garbage woman had just closed the biggest waste management deal in Phoenix history. But I'll get to that part later. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rosa Martinez, and at 58 years old, I thought I'd earned some respect from my children. I was wrong. The moment that shattered everything happened at the engagement party for Marcus and his fiancée Brittany, held at her family's sprawling estate in Scottsdale. Crystal fountains bubbled in the courtyard while servers in white uniforms carried silver trays of champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I had arrived wearing my best outfit, a navy blazer I'd bought specifically for this occasion, though it felt woefully inadequate among the designer dresses that floated around me like expensive clouds. The Ashworth family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across Arizona, and their wealth showed in every detail of their perfectly manicured world. I was the owner of Martinez Waste Solutions, a company I'd built from nothing after my husband died 12 years ago, but somehow I still felt like an outsider in my own son's celebration. Marcus looked handsome in his tailored suit, his dark hair styled perfectly, but there was something cold in his brown eyes when he looked at me. The same eyes that used to light up when I'd come home from my double shifts at the diner, back when he was small and I was everything to him. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of his growing embarrassment about what I did for a living. The confrontation started innocently enough. Brittany's father, Richard Ashworth, was holding court near the bar, regaling a small crowd with stories about his latest acquisition. His voice carried that particular confidence that comes with inherited wealth, the kind that had never known real struggle or uncertainty. The waste management industry, he was saying with obvious disdain, is really the bottom of the barrel, isn't it? I mean, who chooses to work in garbage unless they have absolutely no other options? The group around him chuckled politely, but I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. This was my life's work, he was mocking. The business I'd poured my heart and soul into after Carlos died. The company that had put Marcus through college, that had bought him his first car, that had supported his dreams even when he'd stopped supporting mine. I should have walked away. I should have let it slide, like I'd learned to do with 1,000 other small humiliations over the years. But something in Richard's tone, the casual cruelty of dismissing an entire industry that employed thousands of hardworking people, made my blood boil. Actually, I said, stepping into their circle, waste management is one of the most essential industries in modern society. Without proper waste systems, cities would collapse within weeks. The conversation stopped. Richard turned to look at me with surprise that quickly shifted to barely concealed annoyance. His ice blue eyes swept over my outfit, my appearance, cataloging and dismissing me in seconds. "And you know this how?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Because I own Martinez Waste Solutions," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "We service over 60% of the Phoenix metropolitan area." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the stares of everyone in the immediate vicinity, the uncomfortable shifting as people realized they'd witnessed something awkward. Richard's face went through several expressions before settling on an uncomfortable smile. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose someone has to do it." The dismissal was clear, but before I could respond, Marcus appeared at my elbow. His face was flushed, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "Mom," he said through gritted teeth, "can I talk to you for a minute?" He guided me away from the group, his grip on my arm firm enough to bruise. We walked to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the laughter and clinking glasses of the party that was continuing without us. "What the hell was that?" Marcus hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Your future father-in-law was insulting my profession," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I was simply correcting his misconceptions. "He was making conversation, Mom. You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed me." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, messing up the perfect styling. "Do you have any idea how important tonight is? how important these people are to my future. More important than your mother? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Marcus looked at me with such contempt that I actually took a step backward. You know what your problem is, Mom? You can't accept that I've moved beyond your world. You run around in dirty trucks all day, dealing with actual garbage, and you think that makes you some kind of businesswoman. Each word was a knife, carefully aimed and expertly thrown. But he wasn't done. Brittany's family owns car dealerships, real businesses that matter. They don't have to apologize for what they do or explain why it's important. They just are important. His voice was getting louder, and I could see heads turning in our direction. Marcus, please, I whispered. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're the one who came over here dressed like you're going to a job interview at Walmart, talking about garbage trucks like they're luxury cars. You're the one who can't read a room and realize when you don't belong. The words hung between us like poison gas. I felt something inside my chest crack, not break entirely, but develop a hairline fracture that I knew would never fully heal. I don't belong at my own son's engagement party? My voice was barely audible. Not acting like this, you don't? Marcus glanced back toward the main party, where Brittany was watching us with obvious concern. Look, I'm trying to build something here. A life, a career, a future, with people who matter. And you showing up, talking about garbage collection like it's some noble calling, just makes everything harder. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised alone after his father died, this person I'd sacrificed everything for, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Somewhere along the way, the boy who used to ride in my truck and help me sort recycling had become someone who was ashamed of the very work that had made his privileged life possible. Your father would be ashamed of you, I said quietly. Marcus's face darkened. Don't you dare bring Dad into this. He would understand what I'm trying to accomplish here. He wouldn't want me to be limited by your choices. My choices put you through Arizona State, I shot back. My choices bought you that BMW you're so proud of. My choices paid for the ring you gave Brittany. And I'm grateful for that, Marcus said, but his tone suggested anything but gratitude. But that doesn't mean I have to keep living in the shadow of garbage trucks forever. Some of us want more than just surviving. The crack in my chest widened. What exactly do you think I've been doing all these years, Marcus? Just surviving? Honestly. He looked me up and down one more time, his expression filled with a mixture of pity and disgust that made my stomach turn. Yeah. You've been surviving, barely, in a business that decent people hold their nose around. And the fact that you can't see how that reflects on me, on us, just proves how out of touch you really are. Before I could respond, Brittany appeared beside him, her perfectly manicured hand sliding possessively around his arm. She was beautiful in that effortless way that only money could buy, her blonde hair catching the light from the garden lanterns. Is everything okay over here? She asked, her voice sweet but her eyes calculating as they moved between Marcus and me. Everything's fine, Marcus said quickly. My mom was just...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Leaving. The dismissal was so casual, so complete that for a moment I couldn't process it. He was sending me away from his engagement party like I was an unwelcome solicitor. Marcus, I started. Mom, he interrupted, just go, please. Don't make this worse than it already is. I looked at my son, at the woman who would soon be his wife, at the party full of people who had made it clear I didn't belong in their world. The smart thing to do would have been to leave quietly, to preserve what little dignity I had left and hope that time would heal the wounds that had been opened tonight. Instead, I did something that would change everything. You want to know what human garbage looks like, Marcus? I said, my voice carrying clearly in the night air. It's not the woman who collects it. It's the person who thinks they're too good for the people who made their life possible. I turned and walked toward the parking area, my heels clicking on the stone pathway. Behind me, I could hear Brittany's scandalized whisper and Marcus's angry response. But I didn't look back. I had said what needed to be said, even if it meant burning every bridge between us. But as I drove home through the desert darkness, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized that walking away wasn't enough. Marcus had called his own mother human garbage in front of people who mattered to him. He had chosen his embarrassment over my dignity, his future in-laws, approval over his own family. For 12 years, I had built Martinez Waste Solutions from nothing. I had started with a single-use truck and a determination to provide for my son after his father's sudden heart attack had left us with nothing but debt and grief. I had worked 18-hour days, had fought for every contract, had earned the respect of my competitors and the loyalty of my employees through sheer force of will. Marcus saw it as just garbage collection, but he had no idea what I had really built. He had no idea about the expansion plans I'd been working on, the acquisition deals that were about to transform my small operation into a regional powerhouse. He had no idea that his human garbage mother was about to become one of the most successful businesswomen in Arizona. And most importantly, he had no idea that some of those expansion plans involved contracts that could make or break certain businesses in the Phoenix area. Businesses that depended on reliable waste management services. Businesses like luxury car dealerships that generated enormous amounts of waste from their service departments, their detail operations, their parts warehouses. Businesses exactly like Ashworth Automotive Group. The next morning brought clarity along with the desert sunrise. I sat in my home office, surrounded by the contracts and financial documents that told the real story of Martinez Waste Solutions. The papers that Marcus had never bothered to look at, the achievements he had never cared to understand. The Phoenix Business Journal had run a feature on me just 6 months earlier, calling me one of the city's most innovative entrepreneurs. The article highlighted how I had revolutionized waste management in the region by introducing advanced recycling technologies and sustainable practices that other companies were now scrambling to copy. But more importantly, it had caught the attention of Titan Industries, a national waste management corporation that had been quietly acquiring regional companies across the Southwest. Their offer to buy Martinez Waste Solutions had arrived 2 weeks before Marcus's engagement party, and the number on their letter of intent had made me dizzy: $57 million. They wanted to buy my garbage company for $57 million, keeping me on as regional director with a salary that would put me in the top 1% of earners in Arizona. The deal would give me the resources to expand beyond anything I had ever dreamed possible. But the offer came with conditions. Titan wanted to consolidate all waste management services in the Phoenix metro area under their umbrella. That meant renegotiating every existing contract, every service agreement, every relationship I had built over the past 12 years, including the contract with Ashworth Automotive Group. I pulled up the file on my computer, studying the details I had memorized months ago. Richard Ashworth's dealership group generated approximately 40,000 pounds of waste per month across their 6 locations. Oil filters, tires, packaging materials, metal shavings, and hazardous automotive fluids that required special handling and disposal. It was a lucrative contract, worth nearly $200,000 annually to my company. But more than that, it was the kind of high-profile client that other businesses in the area noticed. When Ashworth Automotive chose Martinez Waste Solutions, it sent a message about quality and reliability that had helped me secure dozens of other commercial accounts. Richard Ashworth had no idea that his casual contempt for my industry had been directed at one of his most important service providers. He had no idea that the woman he had dismissed so casually last night held a contract that was essential to his business operations. And thanks to a clause I had insisted on including in all my commercial contracts, I could terminate service with 30 days notice for any reason I deemed appropriate. I spent the morning reviewing every detail of the Ashworth contract, making sure I understood exactly what canceling it would mean. Their waste disposal needs were specialized enough that finding a replacement provider would take time. Most companies in my industry were already operating at capacity, and the few that might have availability would charge premium rates for taking on such a large account on short notice. But the real impact wouldn't be financial. It would be reputational. In the tight-knit world of Phoenix business, word traveled fast. If Ashworth Automotive suddenly found themselves scrambling for waste management services, their competitors would notice. Their customers would notice. Their pristine image as a well-run operation would take a hit. And there was something else. Something that made the whole situation even more delicious. Marcus had recently been hired as a junior sales manager at Ashworth's flagship location. According to the proud announcement Brittany had posted on social media, he was being considered for a promotion to regional sales director, a position that would set him up for long-term success within the company. Richard Ashworth was not just my son's future father-in-law, he was also his boss. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Margaret Chen, my attorney. Margaret had handled the incorporation of my business and had negotiated most of my major contracts over the years. She was sharp, professional, and had a reputation for protecting her clients' interests with the intensity of a mama bear defending her cubs. "Rosa," Margaret's voice was warm when she answered, "how did the engagement party go last night?" "It was educational," I said, my voice dry. "I need to discuss terminating the Ashworth automotive contract." There was a pause. Margaret knew how important that contract was to my business. "What happened?" I gave her the abbreviated version of the previous night's events, focusing on the business implications rather than the personal hurt. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. "So you want to cancel their service as, what, revenge?" she asked when I finished. "I want to cancel their service because I don't feel comfortable continuing a business relationship with people who have such obvious contempt for my industry and my company," I corrected. "The fact that it might inconvenience them is just a side effect." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her flipping through papers. "Looking at the contract now, you're well within your rights to terminate with 30 days' notice. No cause required." "But Rosa, are you sure about this? It's a lot of money to walk away from." "I'm not walking away from anything," I said. "I'm making a business decision based on my company's values and reputation. Besides, the Titan deal is going to change everything anyway." "The Titan deal?" Margaret's voice sharpened with interest. "You decided to accept their offer?" I hadn't, actually. The letter of intent was still sitting in my desk drawer, unsigned. But Marcus's words from the night before had crystallized something for me. He was right about one thing. It was time for me to move beyond my current world. Just not in the way he had meant. "I'm seriously considering it," I said, "which means I need to start thinking strategically about which relationships are worth preserving and which ones aren't. And you've decided the Ashworths aren't worth preserving." "I've decided that anyone who thinks my work makes me human garbage isn't someone I want to do business with." Margaret was quiet again, and I could practically hear her weighing the legal and financial implications. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll draft the termination letter this afternoon. 30 days notice, effective immediately upon delivery. Do you want me to include a reason?" "Just that we're restructuring our client base to focus on partners who align with our company values." Professional and vague, I like it. I could hear the approval in Margaret's voice. "Rosa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Is this really about business, or is this about your son?" The question hung in the air between us. Margaret had known me for 8 years, had watched me build my company from a struggling startup to a regional success story. She had also listened to me worry about Marcus during his rebellious teenage years, had celebrated with me when he graduated college, had helped me set up the trust fund that would ensure his financial security regardless of what happened to my business. She knew me well enough to see through my professional justifications to the hurt and anger underneath. "It's about both," I admitted. "Marcus made it clear last night that he's ashamed of what I do, ashamed of who I am. Richard Ashworth made it clear that he sees my entire industry as beneath his notice. I can't change how they feel, but I don't have to subsidize their contempt by continuing to provide them with services they clearly don't value. And if this affects Marcus's job, then maybe he'll learn that actions have consequences," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "Maybe he'll learn that the people he's so eager to dismiss are more powerful than he realized." Margaret sighed. "All right, I'll have the letter ready by close of business today. How do you want to deliver it?" "Certified mail to Richard Ashworth personally, with copies to their general manager and accounting department. I want to make sure there's no confusion about the timeline." "Done. And Rosa? For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice." Sometimes you have to show people your value by taking it away. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat in my office for a long time, staring out the window at the Martinez Waste Solutions yard. 36 trucks in various stages of maintenance and loading, a state-of-the-art recycling facility that processed materials for half the city, and 62 employees who depended on the decisions I made every day. This wasn't just about Marcus, or Richard Ashworth, or even my wounded pride. This was about respect. Respect for my industry, respect for my employees, respect for the work that kept cities functioning and communities healthy. I had spent 12 years building something significant, something that mattered. If my own son couldn't see that, if the people he wanted to impress couldn't see that, then maybe it was time to show them exactly what they had been taking for granted. I pulled out the Titan Industries letter and read through it one more time. $57 million for a garbage company. $57 million for a business that a luxury car dealer thought was the bottom of the barrel. I picked up my pen and signed my name at the bottom of the acceptance letter. The next phase of my life was about to begin, and Marcus was going to learn exactly what kind of power his human garbage mother really wielded in the world he was so desperate to be part of. But first, the Ashworths were going to get a very expensive education in the value of waste management services. And my son was going to discover that when you call someone human garbage, you'd better make sure they're not holding the keys to your future in their hands. The termination letter was delivered to Ashworth Automotive Group at exactly 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I know the precise time because I had arranged for a process server to hand-deliver it directly to Richard Ashworth while he was in a meeting with his senior sales staff. The timing wasn't accidental. I wanted him to receive it in front of his employees, the same way he had humiliated me in front of his guests. I wanted him to feel that moment of confusion and dawning realization while other people watched. Marcus called me at 11:47 a.m., less than 90 minutes after the letter was delivered. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was shaking with rage. "I made a business decision," I replied calmly. I was in my office, reviewing the final details of the Titan acquisition, feeling more centered than I had in years. Richard Ashworth just walked into our sales meeting and asked if anyone knew why Martinez Waste Solutions was terminating their contract. Do you have any idea how that made me look? I imagine it made you look like someone whose mother doesn't appreciate being called human garbage. There was silence on the other end of the line. I could picture Marcus in his cubicle at the dealership, probably surrounded by coworkers who were all pretending not to listen to his phone call. "You can't do this," he said finally. "I already did it. The contract terminates in 30 days. Mom, please. You don't understand what this means for me." Richard was about to announce my promotion to regional sales director. Now he's questioning whether I can be trusted, whether my family connections are going to cause problems for the company. The irony was almost too perfect. Marcus had spent the engagement party trying to distance himself from his family connections, and now those same connections were threatening his career advancement. "You should have thought about that before you decided you were too good for the garbage business," I said. "This isn't just about me." Marcus's voice was getting louder, more desperate. "This affects everyone who works here. The service department is already backed up. And if they can't get their waste picked up on schedule, it's going to impact customer service. You're hurting innocent people just to get back at me. I'm terminating a contract with a company whose leadership has made it clear they don't value waste management services. If they're so confident that any replacement provider will do just as well, then they shouldn't have any problem finding someone else. You know it's not that simple. You know they won't be able to find anyone else who can handle their volume on such short notice." I did know that. It was exactly what I was counting on. "That sounds like a them problem, not a me problem," I said, using the phrase Marcus had thrown at me countless times over the years when I had asked him for help with various things. "Mom, I'm begging you, please don't do this. I'll apologize for what I said at the party. I'll make it right." "What exactly will you apologize for, Marcus?" Another pause. I could hear voices in the background, probably his coworkers discussing the chaos that was about to descend on their workplace. For saying those things about your business, for embarrassing you in front of Brittany's family." "What things about my business?" "You know what I said. I want to hear you say it." The silence stretched longer this time. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. For calling what you do, for saying you were human garbage. And do you actually feel sorry for saying that? Or are you just sorry that it's going to cost you a promotion? No answer. That's what I thought, I said. The contract termination stands. You have 30 days to help your employer find alternative arrangements. And if I lose my job over this, quote, then maybe you'll have a better appreciation for the job that paid for your college education and your car and your lifestyle. I hung up before he could respond. The next call came an hour later, from Richard Ashworth himself. Mrs. Martinez. His voice was tightly controlled. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I don't think so, Mr. Ashworth. The termination letter was quite clear. I'd like to meet with you to discuss this. Perhaps we can resolve whatever issue has prompted this decision. The issue is that your organization has made it clear that you don't value waste management services, or the people who provide them. I'm simply adjusting my client base to focus on businesses that appreciate the importance of what we do. Mrs. Martinez, I'm not sure what happened at the engagement party, but if someone said something inappropriate— Someone did say something inappropriate, I interrupted. They said that waste management was the bottom of the barrel, and that only people with no other options would choose to work in garbage. Do you remember who said that? The silence told me everything I needed to know. I see you do remember, I continued. What you may not remember is that you said it to the owner of your waste management company, in front of my son, who works for you, after accepting my congratulations on his engagement to your daughter. Mrs. Martinez, I had no idea. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Ashworth. You had no idea who you were talking to, no idea what my company does for yours, no idea how essential our services are to your operations. You just assumed that because I work in waste management, I must be someone you could dismiss without consequences. I sincerely apologize for any offense. I'm not interested in apologies, Mr. Ashworth. I'm interested in working with clients who respect my business and my industry. Since you've made it clear that you don't fall into that category, I think it's best if we part ways. Mrs. Martinez, please, be reasonable. We can increase our contract amount if that's what this is about. This isn't about money, Mr. Ashworth. This is about respect. And respect isn't something you can buy after you've already thrown it away. I ended the call and immediately put Richard Ashworth's number on my blocked list. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in the ripple effects of business decisions. Word spread quickly through Phoenix's business community that Martinez Waste Solutions had terminated their contract with Ashworth Automotive Group. The rumor mill went into overdrive, with speculation ranging from payment disputes to service failures. I didn't confirm or deny any of the rumors. I simply stated, when asked, that we were focusing our resources on clients who better aligned with our company values. Meanwhile, the Ashworth dealerships were scrambling. They contacted every waste management company in the Phoenix area, only to discover what I had already known. Everyone was either at capacity or unwilling to take on such a large contract on short notice. The few companies that could theoretically handle the work quoted prices that were nearly double what they had been paying me. And even at those premium rates, most were reluctant to commit to the specialized handling requirements for automotive waste. By the end of the second week, the situation had become critical. The service departments at 3 of the 6 Ashworth locations were operating with severely reduced capacity because they couldn't properly dispose of the waste generated by routine maintenance and repairs. Customer complaints started trickling in as appointments were delayed and service times increased. The Ashworth reputation for efficiency and customer service, built over 30 years, was being undermined by something as basic as garbage collection. Marcus called me every other day during those 3 weeks, his voice becoming more strained with each conversation. The promotion he had been promised was indefinitely postponed. Richard Ashworth barely spoke to him anymore. Brittany was fielding angry calls from her father about her future mother-in-law's unreasonable behavior. "You're destroying my life," Marcus said during what would turn out to be our final conversation. "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm simply refusing to enable people who don't respect me or my work. This is insane, Mom. You're tanking a relationship with one of the biggest automotive groups in Arizona because your feelings got hurt. My feelings didn't get hurt, Marcus. My business was insulted, my industry was demeaned, and my value as a service provider was dismissed. These are professional issues, not personal ones. Professional issues? Marcus laughed bitterly. You're ending a contract because you didn't like what someone said at a party. That's the definition of personal. I'm ending a contract because the client demonstrated that they don't understand or appreciate the services they're receiving. That kind of attitude inevitably leads to problems down the road. What problems? We paid our bills on time. We never complained about your service. What more do you want? I want to work with people who see waste management as an essential service, not as something beneath their notice. I want clients who understand that what I do requires expertise, innovation, and significant investment in equipment and personnel. And you think Richard Ashworth doesn't understand that? I think Richard Ashworth sees waste management as a necessary evil that he wishes he didn't have to think about. I think he assumes that anyone can do what I do, and that the only reason someone would choose this industry is because they couldn't succeed at anything else. Maybe he does think that. So what? You're still providing a service, and he's still paying for it. Why does his opinion matter? The question revealed everything that was wrong with Marcus's understanding of business and relationships. He saw commercial transactions as purely transactional, divorced from respect or recognition or basic human dignity. His opinion matters because it affects how he treats my employees when they're on his property. It affects how he responds when we need to adjust our service schedules or implement new procedures. It affects whether he recommends us to other businesses or badmouths us at industry events. I paused, trying to find words that would help him understand. Marcus, when someone fundamentally doesn't respect what you do, that disrespect seeps into every aspect of your relationship with them. It might not show up immediately, but eventually it will cause problems. I've learned to identify those red flags early and avoid them. By destroying their business and mine in the process, by protecting my business from clients who will ultimately be more trouble than they're worth. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder. You know what, Mom? Maybe Richard was right. Maybe waste management really is the bottom of the barrel. Because only someone from the bottom of the barrel would be petty enough to hurt innocent people just to prove a point. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my voice steady. And maybe you're exactly where you belong, Marcus. Working for people who think you're worth more than your mother, right up until the moment when your connection to her becomes inconvenient for them. I hung up for the last time. 3 days later, Margaret called with news that was both expected and satisfying. Ashworth Automotive just filed for a temporary restraining order to force you to continue service until they can find a replacement provider, she said. On what grounds? Breach of contract and intentional interference with business operations. They're claiming that terminating service without cause constitutes a violation of your agreement. I smiled, settling back in my chair. And what did you tell the judge? I told the judge that the contract clearly states that either party may terminate with 30 days notice for any reason. I also submitted copies of all our correspondence showing that we've fulfilled our obligations completely during the notice period. And the judge threw out their request. He said that if they couldn't find adequate waste management services in a market the size of Phoenix, that was a failure of planning on their part, not a legal issue with your contract. The victory felt appropriate but not satisfying. I wasn't interested in destroying Richard Ashworth's business, just in demonstrating the value of what he had taken for granted. But the real satisfaction came the following week, when the Titan Industries acquisition was finalized. The announcement made the front page of the Phoenix Business Journal. Local waste management pioneer sells company for $57 million. Read the headline, accompanied by a photo of me shaking hands with Titan's CEO in front of a gleaming new fleet of trucks. The article detailed my journey from a single truck operation to a regional powerhouse, highlighting the innovative recycling technologies and sustainable practices that had set Martinez Waste Solutions apart from the competition. It mentioned my appointment as regional director for Titan's Southwest Division, a position that would put me in charge of operations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. But the most important detail was buried in the third paragraph. As part of the acquisition, Titan Industries will be expanding service capacity throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, with plans to hire an additional 200 employees over the next 18 months. That expansion meant Titan could now handle large commercial accounts that had previously been beyond their capacity. Accounts exactly like Ashworth Automotive Group. Richard Ashworth called me the day the article came out. "Congratulations on your sale," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you," I replied. "I was wondering if, now that you're working with Titan, there might be an opportunity to discuss reinstating service to our locations. I'll have to refer you to our new account management department. I'm no longer involved in day-to-day service decisions." It wasn't entirely true. As regional director, I had significant input on major account decisions, but I wanted Richard to experience the same kind of dismissal he had given me. "Mrs. Martinez, please. I know we got off on the wrong foot, but surely we can put that behind us and focus on business." "Mr. Ashworth, I think you'll find that Titan Industries has very high standards for their commercial clients. They're particularly selective about working with businesses that understand and appreciate the complexity of modern waste management services." "What does that mean?" "It means you'll need to convince them that you see waste management as a critical partner in your operations, not as a necessary evil you'd prefer to ignore." "And how exactly would I do that?" "That's something you'll need to figure out for yourself. Just like you had to figure out how to handle your waste disposal needs when I terminated our contract." The silence stretched between us. "Mrs. Martinez, I know I made some inappropriate comments at the engagement party. I was wrong, and I apologize. Can't we move past this?" "Mr. Ashworth, your comments weren't just inappropriate. They demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of my industry and a lack of respect for the people who work in it. Those aren't character flaws that can be fixed with an apology. What would it take for you to recommend us to Titan?" The question was exactly what I had been waiting for. It would take a public acknowledgement of the importance of waste management services to your business operations. It would take a commitment to treating waste management professionals with the same respect you show to any other critical service provider. And it would take a personal guarantee from you that my son's employment with your company won't be affected by your business relationship with mine. "Done," Richard said immediately. The investigation started with a single phone call from Detective Sarah Kim of the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Her voice was professional but cautious when she introduced herself, the kind of tone that suggested she was used to dealing with people who had reasons to be nervous about law enforcement. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm calling about some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding Martinez Waste Solutions. Would you be available to meet with me this week?" I was sitting in my new office at Titan Industries, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown Phoenix skyline. The space was a far cry from the cramped trailer that had served as my headquarters for 12 years, but the detective's call brought me crashing back to earth. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, my heart rate accelerating despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at the police station, and I spent the intervening 24 hours in a state of controlled panic. I called Margaret Chen immediately after hanging up with Detective Kim, but she was in court and wouldn't be able to return my call until the evening. When she finally called back, her voice was tense with concern. "Rosa, do you have any idea what this might be about? Any issues with your contracts, your employees, your waste disposal practices?" "Nothing," I said, pacing around my home office. "We've always been scrupulously careful about following regulations. All our drivers are properly licensed. All our disposal sites are certified. All our financial records are clean." "What about the Ashworth situation? Could they have filed some kind of complaint?" I had considered that possibility, but it didn't make sense. Terminating a contract wasn't illegal, even if it caused inconvenience for the client. "I can't see how," I said. "We fulfilled all our obligations during the notice period. We didn't breach any terms of the agreement." "Okay. I'll meet you at the station tomorrow. Don't answer any questions without me present, and don't volunteer any information beyond what they specifically ask for." The Phoenix Police Department's headquarters was a fortress-like building in downtown, all concrete and steel and bulletproof glass. Detective Kim met us in the lobby, A woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "Mrs. Martinez, thank you for coming in. This shouldn't take too long." She led us to a small conference room with fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture that made everything look slightly sickly. A recording device sat in the center of the table like a mechanical spider. "Before we begin, Detective Kim said I want to clarify that you're not under arrest and you're free to leave at any time. However, we are investigating potential criminal activity, and anything you say could be used in legal proceedings." My mouth went dry. Criminal activity. Whatever this was about, it was serious enough to involve the possibility of charges being filed. "What kind of criminal activity?" Margaret asked. Detective Kim opened a manila folder and spread several documents across the table. I recognized them immediately. Financial records from Martinez Waste Solutions, dating back to the early days of the company. "We've received allegations that Martinez Waste Solutions has been engaging in systematic financial fraud, specifically related to billing practices and contract negotiations." "Allegations from whom?" Margaret's voice was sharp. "I can't reveal the source of the complaint at this time, but the allegations are serious enough that we've opened a formal investigation." Detective Kim pulled out a highlighted document that made my stomach drop. It was a copy of my contract with Phoenix Municipal Services, the deal that had launched my company from a struggling startup to a legitimate business. "Mrs. Martinez, can you explain the circumstances under which you secured this contract?" I looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly. "It was a competitive bidding process," I said carefully. "I submitted a proposal along with several other companies, and my bid was selected. Your bid was significantly lower than your competitors'," Detective Kim observed. "In fact, it was so low that some industry experts questioned whether you could fulfill the contract obligations at that price point. I was a new company trying to establish myself in the market. It's common practice to bid aggressively when you're building a client base. But according to these records, you lost money on that contract for the first 18 months. Substantial amounts of money. How did you manage to stay in business?" I felt like I was walking through a minefield, each answer potentially triggering an explosion I couldn't see coming. "I took out loans to cover the shortfall. I worked without taking a salary. I did whatever was necessary to fulfill my obligations to the client." "And where did these loans come from?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I knew exactly where this was heading now, and the knowledge made my hands shake. "Various sources. Banks, private lenders, personal loans from friends and family." Detective Kim pulled out another document, this one a bank statement from 2012. "According to these records, you received a cash deposit of $75,000 in March of 2012. The source is listed as private investor. Can you tell me who this investor was?" The room felt like it was spinning. That $75,000 had saved my company when I was 3 months behind on payments to my employees and facing bankruptcy. It had come at exactly the right moment, when I was desperate enough to accept help from anyone willing to provide it. The investor had been Victor Restrepo, a businessman who owned several auto repair shops in South Phoenix. He had approached me through a mutual acquaintance, offering to provide bridge financing in exchange for preferred vendor status for waste disposal services at his locations. At the time, it had seemed like a godsend. Victor's shops generated steady waste streams, and his referrals had helped me secure contracts with other automotive businesses throughout the city. The arrangement had been mutually beneficial for years. What I hadn't known until much later was that Victor Restrepo was under investigation by the DEA for money laundering. What I hadn't known was that several of his businesses were suspected fronts for drug trafficking operations. What I hadn't known was that the $75,000 he had invested in my company might have been proceeds from illegal activities. By the time I learned about Victor's legal troubles, 3 years after our initial agreement, it was too late to extricate myself from the relationship without destroying my business. Victor had never asked me to do anything illegal, had never involved me in any questionable activities. He had simply been a client who paid his bills on time and referred other customers to my company. But now, sitting in this sterile conference room with a detective asking pointed questions about that long-ago investment, I realized how naive I had been. how dangerous it could be to accept help without asking enough questions about where that help was coming from. The investor preferred to remain anonymous. Quote, I said, finally. The transaction was handled through intermediaries. Detective Kim's expression didn't change, but I could see skepticism in her eyes. Mrs. Martinez, money laundering is a serious federal crime. If you knowingly accepted proceeds from illegal activities, you could be facing significant charges. I never knowingly accepted anything illegal, I said, and it was true. At the time of the investment, I had been focused entirely on saving my business and providing for my son. I hadn't conducted background checks on potential investors or investigated the source of their funds. But you did accept $75,000 in cash from someone whose identity you never verified? Margaret placed a warning hand on my arm. Detective Kim, she said, if you have specific allegations to make against my client, I'd like to hear them. Otherwise, this seems like a fishing expedition. We have evidence suggesting that Martinez Waste Solutions may have been used as a vehicle for laundering money through inflated contracts and phantom services. We're giving Mrs. Martinez an opportunity to cooperate with our investigation before we proceed with more formal measures. The words hit me like a freight train. Money laundering. Phantom services. These weren't accusations I could dismiss or explain away with good intentions and ignorance. I need to speak with my client privately, Margaret said firmly. Detective Kim nodded and left the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell being locked. Rosa, Margaret's voice was urgent, you need to tell me everything, right now. Every detail about your relationship with this investor, every transaction that might look questionable, every client who might have connections to illegal activities. I spent the next hour laying out the complicated web of relationships and financial arrangements that had sustained my business through its early years. The picture that emerged was more troubling than I had ever realized. Victor Restrepo hadn't been my only client with questionable connections. There had been Tony Marchetti, who owned a chain of restaurants that generated enormous amounts of waste and always paid in cash. There had been Desert Sun Construction, a company that specialized in rapid commercial projects and never seemed to worry about cost overruns on waste disposal services. Individually, none of these relationships had seemed problematic. But viewed together, through the lens of a financial crimes investigation, they painted a picture of a business that had been either incredibly naive or deliberately complicit in money laundering operations. How much money are we talking about total? Margaret asked when I finished my recitation. I did quick mental calculations, adding up the various investments, overpayments, and suspicious cash transactions over the years. Maybe $500,000, spread out over 8 years. Margaret's face went pale. Rosa, that's enough to destroy your life. If they can prove that you knowingly facilitated money laundering, you're looking at federal prison time. But I didn't know. I protested. I was just trying to keep my business alive and provide for my son. I never asked anyone to break the law, and I never broke any laws myself. Intent matters, but ignorance isn't a complete defense, especially when the amounts are this large and the pattern is this clear. Margaret gathered up her papers and stood to leave. I'm going to talk to Detective Kim about what they need from you. In the meantime, you need to start thinking about worst-case scenarios. If they decide to file charges, your life is going to change dramatically. The ride home was a blur of desert landscape and mounting panic. By the time I reached my house, the full implications of the investigation were starting to sink in. If I was arrested and charged with money laundering, the Titan Industries deal would evaporate overnight. No corporation would want to be associated with an executive under federal investigation. My $57 million windfall would disappear, along with my new position and my plans for the future. But worse than the financial consequences was the realization of how completely I had misjudged my situation. For weeks, I had been savoring my victory over Richard Ashworth and Marcus, feeling powerful and vindicated. I had thought I was teaching them a lesson about respect and consequences. Now I realized that I might have been the one who was about to learn a lesson about the dangers of building a business on questionable foundations. about the risks of accepting help without asking enough questions, about the way that past mistakes could reach across years to destroy everything you had worked to build. That evening, I sat in my home office surrounded by the financial records and contracts that had once represented my success. Now they felt like evidence in a criminal case, each document a potential weapon that could be used against me. The phone rang at 9 p.m. It was Marcus. "Mom, I need to talk to you." His voice was different than it had been during our last conversation. Less angry, more frightened. "What's wrong?" I asked, despite everything that had happened between us. "The police came to my office today. They were asking questions about you, about your business, about whether I knew anything about your financial arrangements." My blood turned to ice. If they were questioning Marcus, the investigation was more serious than Detective Kim had let on. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I didn't know anything about your business operations." "Which is true. But Mom, they seem to know things. Specific things about your clients and your contracts." "What kind of things?" "They asked about Victor Restrepo specifically. They wanted to know if I had ever met him, if I knew anything about his relationship with you." "Victor." The investigation wasn't just about money laundering in general. It was about Victor specifically, and my business was apparently part of a larger case they were building against him. "Marcus, listen to me carefully. Don't talk to the police again without a lawyer present. Don't answer any questions about me or my business, no matter how innocent they seem." "Mom, what's going on? Are you in trouble?" The question forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding all day. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think I might be in very serious trouble." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Is there anything I can do?" Marcus asked finally. The offer surprised me, coming after weeks of hostility and anger between us. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruel things we had said to each other, he was still my son. "Just stay away from this," I said. "Don't let my problems affect your life any more than they already have." "Mom." "I mean it, Marcus. Whatever happens to me, you need to focus on your own future. Don't let my mistakes destroy your opportunities." I hung up before he could respond, before the conversation could become any more emotional than it already was. The next morning brought news that made the previous day's revelations seem trivial by comparison. Margaret called at 7 a.m., her voice tight with urgency. "Rosa, we have a problem. A big problem. Bigger than money laundering charges?" "Much bigger. I just got off the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're not just investigating you for money laundering. They think you're a key figure in Victor Restrepo's entire operation." The words didn't make sense at first. Key figure. Entire operation. I had been a customer of Victor's services and a recipient of his investment. How could that make me a key figure in anything? "Margaret, I don't understand. I provided waste disposal services to Victor's businesses. That's all. According to their theory, your waste disposal services were used to transport and dispose of evidence from drug trafficking operations. They think Victor used your trucks and your facilities to get rid of materials that could link him to criminal activities." The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. "That's impossible. We have strict protocols for what we accept for disposal. We have tracking systems for every load, documentation for every client. We don't dispose of anything without knowing exactly what it is." "They have surveillance footage, Rosa. Video of your trucks leaving Victor's properties with loads that were never properly documented. Video of those same trucks making stops at disposal sites in the middle of the night." The room started spinning around me. Night runs. I remembered them now, though I had pushed them out of my mind years ago. Victor had occasionally requested special pickups outside of normal business hours, claiming that his operations generated sensitive materials that needed to be disposed of discreetly for competitive reasons. I had assigned those runs to Miguel Santos, one of my most trusted drivers, and I had never asked detailed questions about what he was picking up or where he was taking it. Miguel had assured me that everything was legitimate, and I had trusted him because I needed the extra revenue those special runs provided. "Margaret, I swear to you, I never knowingly transported or disposed of anything illegal. If Miguel was doing something wrong, I didn't know about it." Miguel Santos was arrested yesterday morning, Margaret said quietly. He's already agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Miguel had worked for me for 6 years. I had trusted him with sensitive clients and special assignments. I had considered him almost like family. Now he was apparently prepared to testify that I had knowingly participated in criminal activities to save himself from a longer prison sentence. What exactly is he saying about me? I don't have all the details yet, but the preliminary reports suggest he's claiming that you knew about the illegal nature of the materials you were transporting, that you were paid extra money specifically because you agreed to dispose of evidence and never ask questions. That's not true, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see how the situation might look to federal investigators. A struggling business owner accepting cash payments for off-the-book services from a known criminal. Special arrangements that bypassed normal documentation procedures. A pattern of willful ignorance that could easily be interpreted as deliberate complicity. Margaret, what are my options here? Honestly, not many good ones. If Miguel's testimony is credible, and if they have video evidence of the activities he's describing, you could be looking at serious federal charges. Conspiracy, money laundering, accessory to drug trafficking. How serious? 10 to 20 years, potentially. Maybe more if they can prove ongoing criminal enterprise. The numbers hit me like a sledgehammer. 10 to 20 years. I was 58 years old. A sentence like that would effectively be a life sentence. There is one possibility, Margaret continued. If you cooperate with their investigation, if you provide information that helps them build a case against bigger targets, they might be willing to negotiate a plea agreement. What kind of information? Anything you know about Victor's operations, his associates, his methods, financial records, communication, observations about his business practices. But I don't know anything useful. Victor kept his business separate from mine. We had a simple client relationship. Then, we need to hope that the evidence against you isn't as strong as they think it is. But Rosa, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your life as you know it is over. The conversation ended with Margaret promising to gather more information about the charges I was facing and the evidence the government had assembled. I sat in my kitchen after hanging up, staring at the morning newspaper without seeing the words. Everything I had built was crumbling around me. The business I had sold for $57 million had apparently been built on criminal foundations. The son I had tried to teach a lesson about respect was now caught up in a federal investigation because of my mistakes. The future I had planned was evaporating like water in the desert sun. But perhaps the worst part was the growing realization that my financial success hadn't been entirely legitimate. I had convinced myself that I was a self-made entrepreneur who had built something significant through hard work and determination. Now I was forced to confront the possibility that my success had been subsidized by criminal activities, that my rise in the business world had been made possible by money that came from drugs and violence. The phone rang again. This time it was Richard Ashworth. Mrs. Martinez, I just wanted to check in and see how you're settling into your new position at Titan. The irony was overwhelming. A week ago, Richard Ashworth had been desperate to restore his waste management services. Now he was making polite conversation, while my world collapsed around me. I'm adjusting, I said carefully. I was hoping we might be able to discuss reinstating service to our dealerships. I know there were some misunderstandings before, but I'm confident we can work past them. Mr. Ashworth, I don't think that's going to be possible. I'm prepared to offer very competitive terms. And I want to personally apologize for any inappropriate comments I may have made. I realize now how essential waste management services are to our operations. If the situation hadn't been so dire, I might have enjoyed the moment. Richard Ashworth was actually apologizing, actually acknowledging the value of my work. It was everything I had wanted to hear a month ago. Now it felt like receiving a trophy for a race I had won by cheating. Mr. Ashworth, there are some complications with my business situation that make it impossible for me to take on new clients right now. What kind of complications? I almost told him. Almost explained that the woman he had dismissed as human garbage was now facing federal charges for money laundering and drug trafficking. Almost described how the business success he now wanted to be associated with had been built on criminal foundations. Instead, I simply said, legal issues that need to be resolved before I can move forward with any new arrangements. After hanging up, I walked out to my back patio and looked across the desert landscape that had been my home for 30 years. The mountains in the distance were unchanged, eternal and indifferent to human struggles. The saguaro cacti that dotted the horizon had been growing for longer than I had been alive and would continue growing long after I was gone. For the first time since Detective Kim's call, I felt a sense of perspective. Whatever happened to me, whatever consequences I faced for my mistakes and naivete, life would continue. The sun would still rise over the Sonoran Desert. The waste management industry would still function without me. Phoenix would still generate millions of tons of garbage that needed to be collected and processed and disposed of properly. I had built something significant, even if that significance had been tainted by criminal associations I hadn't fully understood. I had provided jobs for dozens of people, had kept neighborhoods clean, had implemented recycling programs that had diverted thousands of tons of materials from landfills. Those achievements couldn't be erased by Miguel Santos's betrayal or Victor Restrepo's criminal activities. They couldn't be negated by federal investigations or money laundering charges. But they also couldn't protect me from the consequences of the choices I had made along the way. The choice to accept money without asking enough questions. The choice to trust employees without proper oversight. The choice to prioritize business growth over careful examination of my client relationships. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no human artist could replicate, I made a decision that would determine the rest of my life. I was going to fight. Not just for my freedom, but for the truth about what I had and hadn't known, what I had and hadn't done. I was going to cooperate with the federal investigation, not to save myself, but to ensure that the real criminals faced justice, while innocent people like my employees were protected. And I was going to face whatever consequences emerged from that fight with the same determination that had carried me through 12 years of building a business from nothing. The garbage woman who had been dismissed as human refuse was about to show everyone exactly what she was made of. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix was a monument to intimidation, all concrete and steel rising into the desert sky like a modern-day fortress. I walked up the steps on a Tuesday morning in October, flanked by Margaret and a new addition to my legal team, Robert Chen, a federal criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of depositions, document reviews, and strategy sessions that had consumed every waking hour of my life. The government's case against me was more complex than I had initially realized, involving not just my relationship with Victor Restrepo, but a web of interconnected businesses that allegedly formed a money laundering network spanning 3 states. According to the prosecution's theory, Martinez Waste Solutions had been a crucial component in this network, providing a legitimate business front for moving and disposing of evidence from drug trafficking operations. They claimed that I had knowingly participated in this scheme, accepting payments that were far above market rates in exchange for my silence and cooperation. The evidence they had assembled was formidable. Bank records showing cash deposits that coincided with special pickup requests from Victor's businesses. Surveillance footage of my trucks making unauthorized stops at remote disposal sites. Testimony from Miguel Santos detailing specific conversations in which I had allegedly acknowledged the illegal nature of the materials we were handling. But there were also significant weaknesses in their case, inconsistencies that Robert Chen had identified during our preparation sessions. Miguel's timeline didn't match the surveillance footage in several key instances. The cash deposits they attributed to criminal payments could be explained by legitimate business activities. Most importantly, they had no recorded conversations or written communications that directly implicated me in criminal activity. The government's case is built on inference and circumstantial evidence. Robert had explained during our final preparation meeting, they're hoping to convince a jury that your pattern of behavior demonstrates criminal intent, even without direct proof of knowledge or participation. The strategy we had developed was simple in concept but risky in execution. Rather than claiming complete ignorance of Victor's activities, which would be difficult to prove given the long-term nature of our business relationship, we would acknowledge that I had suspected something was wrong but had chosen to look the other way out of financial desperation. It wasn't a complete defense, but it distinguished between willful participation in criminal activity and willful blindness to criminal activity. The distinction could mean the difference between a 20-year sentence and a 5-year sentence. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with oak paneling and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sickly. Judge Patricia Reeves presided from an elevated bench, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and her dark eyes missing nothing that happened in her courtroom. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney David Walsh, a man in his 40s with the lean build of a long-distance runner and the intense focus of someone who had built his career on putting white-collar criminals behind bars. His opening statement was methodical and devastating, laying out a timeline of my relationship with Victor Restrepo that made my claims of innocence seem laughable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh began, this case is about greed. Greed that led a struggling business owner to compromise her integrity and violate federal law in pursuit of financial gain. He walked them through the evidence step by step, from my initial contact with Victor through the special disposal arrangements that had continued for nearly 6 years. He showed them bank records, surveillance photos, and excerpts from Miguel Santos's testimony that painted a picture of deliberate criminal conspiracy. The defendant wants you to believe that she was an innocent victim, manipulated by sophisticated criminals into unknowingly participating in their schemes. Walsh continued. But the evidence will show that Rosa Martinez knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that the materials she was disposing of were connected to criminal activity. She knew that the payments she was receiving were far above market rates. And she chose to participate anyway because the money was too good to refuse. Robert's opening statement took a different approach, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while challenging the government's interpretation of my motives and knowledge. My client made mistakes, he told the jury. She made business decisions based on financial desperation rather than careful analysis. She trusted employees who betrayed that trust. She accepted the word of clients who lied to her about the nature of their business activities. He paused, making eye contact with each juror in turn. But making mistakes is not the same as committing crimes. Being naive is not the same as being criminal. And the government's case depends on you believing that desperation and naivete are evidence of criminal intent. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the scope of Victor Restrepo's criminal organization. Federal agents described surveillance operations that had documented drug trafficking activities across Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. They explained how legitimate businesses had been used to launder money and dispose of evidence, creating a network that had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Victor himself testified on the third day, having agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was a small man with graying hair and nervous eyes that darted around the courtroom as he spoke. His testimony was damaging but not fatal, describing our business relationship in terms that suggested I had known more than I was admitting. Rosa was smart, Victor said when asked about my level of knowledge. She never asked direct questions, but she knew. When you've been in business as long as she had, you know when something doesn't add up. Robert's cross-examination focused on Victor's credibility, highlighting the fact that his testimony was part of a plea agreement that could significantly reduce his prison sentence. Mr. Restrepo, isn't it true that your sentence could be reduced by as much as 15 years if you provide testimony that satisfies federal prosecutors? Yes. And isn't it true that you've already admitted to lying to federal agents during your initial interviews? Yes, but... So you've demonstrated that you're willing to lie to federal agents when it serves your interests, and now you have a strong incentive to tell them what they want to hear, regardless of whether it's true? Victor's answer was defensive and unconvincing, exactly what Robert had hoped for. Miguel Santos testified on the fourth day, and his testimony was more problematic. Unlike Victor, Miguel had worked directly for me and could describe specific conversations and instructions that seemed to support the government's case. Mrs. Martinez told me that some clients had special needs. Miguel said, his voice barely audible in the quiet courtroom. She said that sometimes we had to dispose of materials that couldn't go through normal channels, and that I shouldn't ask questions about what we were picking up. Did she ever use the word illegal when describing these special arrangements? Walsh asked. Not directly, but she made it clear that discretion was important. She said that our success depended on being the kind of company that could handle sensitive situations without causing problems for our clients. Robert's cross-examination of Miguel was more aggressive, focusing on the specific benefits he was receiving in exchange for his cooperation. Mr. Santos, when you were arrested, you were facing charges that could have resulted in a 25-year sentence, isn't that correct? Yes. And in exchange for your testimony against Mrs. Martinez, federal prosecutors have agreed to recommend a sentence of no more than 3 years? Yes. So your testimony today could save you 22 years in federal prison? I'm telling the truth. That's not what I asked, Mr. Santos. I asked whether your testimony could save you 22 years in prison. Miguel's reluctant acknowledgement of his incentive to cooperate was important, but it didn't negate the substance of his testimony about my knowledge and instructions. The government's case continued for another week, with testimony from federal agents, forensic accountants, and other participants in Victor's criminal organization. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle they were constructing, building a narrative that portrayed me as a knowing participant, rather than an unwitting victim. But there were also moments that supported our defense. A forensic examination of my computer records showed no evidence of encrypted communications or deleted files that might suggest criminal consciousness. Several former employees testified that I had always emphasized the importance of following regulations and maintaining proper documentation. Most importantly, the government couldn't produce any direct evidence that I had known about the specific criminal activities Victor was engaged in. Their case relied heavily on the inference that I must have known, given the unusual nature of some of our service arrangements and the above-market payments I had received. When it came time for the defense to present our case, Robert made a strategic decision that surprised everyone, including me. Instead of calling character witnesses or expert testimony about industry practices, he put me on the stand to tell my own story. Mrs. Martinez, he began, please tell the jury about your background and how you came to start Martinez Waste Solutions. I spent the better part of a day describing my journey from a young widow struggling to support her son to a successful business owner. I talked about the early years when I had worked 18-hour days and lived on peanut butter sandwiches to keep the company afloat. I described the pride I had felt when I hired my first employees and the satisfaction of building something significant from nothing. But I also talked about the mistakes I had made along the way, the shortcuts I had taken when money was tight, the questions I hadn't asked when the answers might have been uncomfortable, the times when I had prioritized financial survival over careful scrutiny of my business relationships. Did there come a time when you began to suspect that Victor Restrepo might be involved in illegal activities? Robert asked. Yes, I said, and I could feel the tension in the courtroom increase. When did that happen? Gradually, over a period of several years. The special pickup requests became more frequent, and they always involved cash payments that were higher than our standard rates. The materials we were asked to dispose of were sometimes unusual, and Victor's instructions about discretion became more explicit. What did you do when you began to have these suspicions? This was the crucial moment, the question that would determine whether the jury saw me as a criminal or as someone who had made understandable but wrong choices. I chose not to investigate further, I said. I told myself that as long as I wasn't breaking any specific laws, as long as I wasn't disposing of anything that was obviously illegal, it wasn't my responsibility to police my clients' activities. Why did you make that choice? Because I needed the money. My company was still struggling, and Victor's business represented a significant portion of our revenue. I was afraid that if I asked too many questions, I might lose that revenue and have to lay off employees or close the business entirely. The admission was painful but necessary. Robert and I had decided that acknowledging my willful blindness was preferable to claiming complete ignorance, which the jury might not believe given the evidence. Walsh's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. He walked me through each of the questionable transactions and service arrangements, forcing me to acknowledge that I had suspected they were connected to illegal activities but had chosen to continue anyway. So you're testifying that you knew you were probably helping criminals dispose of evidence, but you decided that the money was more important than following the law? I'm testifying that I suspected something was wrong but convinced myself that I wasn't directly participating in anything illegal. And the fact that your trucks were making midnight runs to remote disposal sites didn't raise any red flags for you? It raised concerns, but I rationalized them by telling myself that legitimate businesses sometimes have unusual disposal needs. Even when those unusual needs involved paying you twice the normal rate for services that bypassed your standard documentation procedures? Each question was designed to make my choices look more and more inexcusable, and Walsh was skilled at making reasonable business decisions seem like obvious criminal acts. But Robert had prepared me for this assault, and I tried to maintain composure while acknowledging the questionable nature of my decisions, without admitting to criminal intent. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with both sides making their final appeals to a jury that had listened to 3 weeks of complex testimony about business relationships, financial transactions, and criminal conspiracies. Walsh's closing was a masterpiece of legal argumentation, weaving together the various threads of evidence into a compelling narrative of greed and criminal conspiracy. The defendant wants you to believe that she was just a struggling business owner who made some poor choices, he told the jury. But the evidence shows something much more serious. Rosa Martinez knowingly participated in a criminal organization that was responsible for bringing drugs into our communities and destroying lives. He walked through the evidence one final time, emphasizing the pattern of behavior that suggested deliberate criminal participation rather than innocent mistakes. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about punishing someone for being naive or desperate. It's about holding accountable someone who chose to profit from criminal activity, someone who decided that money was more important than the law. Robert's closing argument focused on the distinction between poor judgment and criminal intent, arguing that the government had failed to prove that I had knowingly participated in criminal activity. My client made mistakes, he acknowledged. She should have asked more questions, should have been more careful about the clients she accepted, should have insisted on proper documentation for all services. He paused, looking directly at the jury. But should have done things differently is not the same as knowingly violated federal law. The government's case is built on inference and speculation, not on direct evidence of criminal knowledge or intent. The jury deliberated for 2 days, a period that felt like 2 years. I spent the time in a hotel room near the courthouse, unable to eat or sleep or focus on anything except the 12 strangers who were deciding my fate. Margaret and Robert tried to remain optimistic, pointing out that the length of deliberation might indicate that some jurors were not convinced by the government's case. But I could see the worry in their eyes, the recognition that we were facing a very real possibility that I would spend the next decade or more in federal prison. On Sunday afternoon, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed when we returned, filled with reporters, federal agents, and observers who had followed the case. I sat between Margaret and Robert, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking, as Judge Reeves instructed the jury foreman to read the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit money laundering, we find the defendant not guilty. The words hit me like a physical force, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling over. Not guilty, the most serious charge, the one that carried a potential 20-year sentence, had been dismissed. On the charge of operating an unlicensed money-transmitting business, we find the defendant guilty. My heart sank. Guilty. Despite everything, despite our best efforts, the jury had found that I had broken federal law. On the charge of willful failure to maintain proper business records, we find the defendant guilty. 2 guilty verdicts out of 3 charges. It could have been worse, but it was still a conviction that would result in a federal prison sentence. Judge Reeves scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving the probation department time to prepare a pre-sentence report that would help determine my punishment. The next 6 weeks were a strange period of limbo, waiting for a sentencing hearing that would determine whether I spent the next several years in prison or received a more lenient punishment that might allow me to rebuild my life. Robert was cautiously optimistic about our chances for a reduced sentence, pointing out that the jury's rejection of the most serious charge suggested they had found my testimony credible. The charges I had been convicted of typically carried sentences of 2 to 5 years, but first-time offenders with no prior criminal history often received lighter punishments. The probation department's investigation was thorough and invasive, involving interviews with dozens of people who had known me over the years. Former employees, business associates, neighbors, and even Marcus were questioned about my character, my business practices, and my role in the community. Marcus called me the night after his interview with the probation officer. "Mom, I wanted you to know that I told them the truth about who you are, about how hard you worked to build your business and provide for our family, about how you always emphasized the importance of doing the right thing, even when it was difficult." The conversation was awkward, still colored by the harsh words we had exchanged months earlier, but there was also something new in his voice. A recognition, perhaps, that the world was more complicated than he had realized, and that the mother he had dismissed as human garbage had been dealing with pressures and choices he had never understood. "I also wanted to apologize," he continued, "for the things I said at the engagement party, for not supporting you when you needed it, for being ashamed of work that I should have been proud of. Marcus, you don't. Yes, I do. I was wrong about a lot of things, and it took watching you go through this to realize how wrong I was." The apology felt genuine, but it also felt like too little, too late. The damage to our relationship had been done, and while his support during the sentencing process was appreciated, it couldn't undo the years of growing distance between us. Brittany had broken up with him 2 weeks after my arrest, apparently deciding that association with a family involved in federal criminal proceedings was incompatible with her social aspirations. Richard Ashworth had terminated Marcus's employment shortly afterward, citing concerns about his judgment and the potential for negative publicity. In a cruel irony, Marcus was now unemployed and facing financial difficulties, dependent on the trust fund I had established years earlier to ensure his security. The waste management money he had been so ashamed of was now the only thing standing between him and serious financial hardship. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold December morning, with the courthouse steps slick with ice and the sky the color of old concrete. I wore a conservative black suit that Margaret had selected, something that would convey remorse and responsibility without appearing overly dramatic. Judge Reeves had a reputation for fairness, but also for taking white-collar crimes seriously. She had sentenced other business executives to significant prison terms for financial crimes, and there was no guarantee that my lack of prior criminal history would result in leniency. The hearing began with testimony from character witnesses, people who had known me for years and could speak to my integrity and contributions to the community. My former pastor talked about my volunteer work with homeless shelters. The principal of Marcus's old elementary school described my involvement in fundraising efforts for school programs. Most surprisingly, several of my former employees took the stand to testify on my behalf. They described me as a fair and ethical employer, who had always emphasized the importance of following regulations and treating employees with respect. "Mrs. Martinez saved my life," said Carmen Rodriguez, a single mother who had worked for me for 8 years. "When my daughter got sick and I needed time off for doctor appointments, she made sure I could keep my job and my health insurance. She's the most honest person I've ever worked for." The prosecution's sentencing memorandum was brief but pointed, arguing that my crimes had undermined the integrity of the financial system and that deterrence required a meaningful prison sentence. "The defendant may not have been the mastermind of this criminal organization," Walsh wrote, "but her willingness to look the other way in exchange for financial benefit enabled serious crimes to be committed. A substantial sentence is necessary to deter other business owners from making similar choices." Robert's sentencing memorandum was longer and more detailed, emphasizing my lack of prior criminal history, my contributions to the community, and the evidence that I had been a peripheral rather than central figure in Victor Restrepo's criminal enterprise. When it came time for me to address the court, I had prepared a statement that acknowledged my mistakes while trying to convey the context in which I had made them. "Your Honor, I want to begin by accepting full responsibility for my actions. I made decisions that were wrong, both legally and morally, and I deeply regret the harm that those decisions may have caused." I paused, looking at the judge who held my future in her hands. "I started my business after my husband died, trying to create a stable life for my son and provide employment for people in my community. Along the way, I lost sight of the values that should have guided my decisions. I allowed financial pressure to cloud my judgment, and I chose to ignore warning signs that should have prompted me to end business relationships that had become problematic. I could see Marcus in the gallery behind me, his face serious but supportive for the first time in years. I understand that my choices contributed to criminal activities that harmed communities and families. I understand that claiming ignorance is not a defense when that ignorance was willful. And I understand that I must face consequences for those choices. Judge Reeves listened without expression, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad in front of her. But I also want the court to know that my mistakes do not define the entirety of my business or my character. For 12 years, Martinez Waste Solutions provided essential services to our community while creating jobs and implementing environmental programs that benefited thousands of people. The criminal aspects of my business were an aberration, not the norm. I concluded by promising to continue serving my community in whatever way was possible, regardless of the sentence I received. Judge Reeves took a brief recess before announcing her decision, leaving me to sit in the courtroom and contemplate the possible outcomes. 2 to 5 years was the typical range for the charges I had been convicted of, but judges had significant discretion in sentencing, and there was no way to predict what punishment she would impose. When court reconvened, Judge Reeves delivered a lengthy statement about the seriousness of financial crimes and the importance of maintaining integrity in business relationships. She acknowledged the character testimony and my lack of prior criminal history, but emphasized that my crimes had enabled more serious criminal activity. "Mrs. Martinez, your crimes were not victimless," she said. "Your willingness to look the other way in exchange for financial benefit enabled a criminal organization that brought drugs into our communities and corrupted legitimate businesses." She paused, consulting her notes. "However, the court also recognizes that you were not a leader or organizer of this criminal enterprise. You were a business owner who made poor choices under financial pressure, choices that you appear to genuinely regret." The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as she prepared to announce my sentence. "The court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. You will also pay a fine of $50,000 and perform 500 hours of community service." 18 months. It was less than I had feared, but more than I had hoped. 18 months of my life would be spent in federal prison, away from my family and my community, paying for choices I had made in desperation and ignorance. But it was also a sentence that would allow me to rebuild my life afterward, to find new ways to contribute to my community, and perhaps repair the relationship with my son that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and resentment. As the court officers approached to begin the process of taking me into custody, I turned to look at Marcus one final time. He was crying, and for the first time in years I could see the little boy who used to ride in my garbage truck and help me sort recycling on Sunday afternoons. The waste management empire that had started as a desperate attempt to provide for my son was over, destroyed by the very criminal associations that had helped make it possible. But perhaps something better could rise from its ashes. Something built on the hard-earned wisdom that came from learning the true cost of compromising your values for financial gain. Federal prison was nothing like what I had imagined from movies or television shows. The Tucson Federal Correctional Institution was a sprawling complex of beige buildings surrounded by chain-link fences and desert landscape that stretched to the mountains on the horizon. It looked more like a depressing community college than a place where dangerous criminals were held. My cellmate was Dr. Patricia Williamson, a former pharmaceutical executive who had been convicted of healthcare fraud. She was 10 years younger than me, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of precise manner that suggested she had spent her career in boardrooms, making life-and-death decisions about drug pricing and clinical trials. "First time?" she asked when I was assigned to the bottom bunk in our 8-by-10-foot cell. "First time," I confirmed, trying to keep my voice steady despite the overwhelming anxiety that had consumed me since the moment the court officers had placed handcuffs on my wrists. "It gets easier," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "The key is to find a routine and stick to it. Routine is what keeps you sane in here." The routine she described became my lifeline over the following months. Wake at 5:30 a.m. for count, breakfast at 6 o'clock, work assignment from 7 o'clock to 11 o'clock, lunch, afternoon programming, dinner, evening recreation, and lights out at 10 p.m. Every day exactly the same, predictable in a way that my business life had never been. My work assignment was in the prison library, a job that Patricia had arranged through connections she had developed during her 2 years of incarceration. It was considered one of the better positions available to new inmates, involving cataloging books, helping other prisoners with legal research, and assisting with educational programs. The library became my sanctuary, a quiet space filled with books about everything from advanced mathematics to historical biographies. I spent my free time reading voraciously, catching up on all the novels and nonfiction works I had never had time for during the years when I was building my business. But it was a book about environmental restoration that changed the trajectory of my incarceration and, ultimately, the rest of my life. The book described innovative approaches to cleaning up contaminated land, turning former industrial sites into productive agricultural areas or recreational spaces. The techniques involved sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry, waste processing, and environmental engineering, all areas that overlapped with my background in waste management. As I read about these restoration projects, I began to see connections between the work I had done for 12 years and the environmental challenges facing communities throughout the Southwest. Abandoned mining sites, closed landfills, contaminated industrial properties, all of them represented opportunities to apply waste management expertise to genuine environmental healing. I started researching grant programs and nonprofit organizations focused on environmental restoration, spending hours in the library studying funding mechanisms and regulatory frameworks. Patricia, who had maintained connections in the business world despite her legal troubles, helped me understand how to structure a nonprofit organization that could pursue this kind of work. "You know," she said one evening as we discussed my research, "there's real money in environmental cleanup. Government contracts, foundation grants, corporate partnerships with companies that need to offset their environmental impact." "I'm not interested in making money," I replied. "I'm interested in making amends." Patricia studied me with the analytical gaze that had probably served her well in pharmaceutical boardrooms. "Rosa, you can't make amends if you can't pay for the work you want to do. Environmental restoration requires significant capital investment, specialized equipment, and technical expertise. If you want to actually help communities, you need to think like a businesswoman, not like a penitent sinner." Her words forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding since my sentencing. I couldn't escape my nature as an entrepreneur, couldn't abandon the skills that had allowed me to build Martinez Waste Solutions from nothing. If I wanted to contribute something meaningful to the world after my release, I would need to apply those same skills to environmental restoration work. The idea that began forming in my mind was ambitious beyond anything I had previously attempted. A non-profit organization that would focus specifically on cleaning up contaminated sites in low-income communities, areas that were often overlooked by for-profit environmental companies because the work wasn't sufficiently profitable. These communities, many of them predominantly Hispanic like the neighborhood where I had grown up, were disproportionately affected by environmental contamination from industrial activities, inadequate waste disposal, and legacy pollution from mining and manufacturing operations. What they needed was an organization that could navigate the complex regulatory environment surrounding environmental cleanup, while applying waste management expertise to the actual restoration work. An organization that could secure funding from multiple sources and coordinate with government agencies, community groups, and technical specialists. An organization that could turn environmental liabilities into community assets. I spent the final 6 months of my incarceration developing a comprehensive business plan for what I decided to call the Desert Renewal Foundation. The plan included detailed analyses of funding sources, regulatory requirements, and technical approaches to different types of environmental restoration projects. Patricia connected me with her former assistant, Sarah Kim, who had left the pharmaceutical industry to work in the nonprofit sector. Sarah visited me twice at the prison, reviewing my plans and offering suggestions about organizational structure and grant writing strategies. "This could really work," Sarah said during our second meeting. "There's enormous demand for this kind of work, and you have exactly the right background to make it successful. Waste management experience, business development skills, connections in the environmental services industry." "What about my criminal record?" I asked. "Won't that make it impossible to secure funding or government contracts?" "It will be a challenge," Sarah admitted. "But it's not insurmountable. Nonprofits are generally more willing to work with people who have made mistakes and learned from them. And your conviction was for financial crimes, not environmental violations. That actually makes you more credible, not less. Marcus visited me for the first time 3 months before my release date. The federal prison visiting room was a sterile space with plastic chairs and vending machines, designed to minimize physical contact between inmates and their visitors. He looked older than his 28 years, with stress lines around his eyes and a wariness that hadn't been there before my legal troubles began. The confident young man who had been embarrassed by his mother's profession had been replaced by someone who had learned hard lessons about the unpredictability of life. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. "I've had time to think, time to plan for what comes next." "What does come next?" I described the Desert Renewal Foundation concept, explaining how I hoped to apply my waste management expertise to environmental restoration work. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "It sounds like you're planning to start another business," he said when I finished. "A non-profit organization, not a business. The goal is community service, not profit. But it's still going to require the same kind of skills you used to build Martinez Waste Solutions: management, fundraising, business development." "Yes, but applied to different ends." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Mom, I owe you an apology. A real one, not the desperate plea I made when you terminated the Ashworth contract." "Marcus, no, let me finish. I was wrong about everything. Wrong about your work. Wrong about what success means. Wrong about the kind of person you are." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since entering the visiting room. I spent my whole adult life trying to distance myself from waste management, trying to convince myself and everyone else that I was better than that. And then I watched you handle this whole legal situation with more dignity and strength than I've ever shown in my entire life. "You were young," I said. "Young people are supposed to want something different than what their parents achieved. There's a difference between wanting something different and being ashamed of where you came from." I was ashamed, and that shame made me cruel to the person who sacrificed everything for me. The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus describing his struggles since losing his job at Ashworth Automotive, and his growing appreciation for the work ethic and integrity that had built Martinez Waste Solutions. "I want to help," he said as our visit neared its end. "With the foundation, with whatever you're planning to do next. I don't have business experience, but I can learn. And I understand now that what you do matters, regardless of whether other people recognize it. Marcus, you don't owe me anything. You certainly don't owe me your career. It's not about owing you anything. It's about being part of something meaningful, something that actually helps people instead of just making money for people who already have enough." His offer surprised me, but it also felt like a completion of some kind. The son who had been embarrassed by his mother's work was now volunteering to join her in a new venture that would be even more directly focused on serving communities that others ignored. My release date arrived on a warm April morning, with desert wildflowers blooming along the highways and the mountains surrounding Tucson sharp against a cloudless sky. Sarah Kim picked me up at the prison gates, driving a used Honda Civic that reflected the modest budget we would be working with as we launched the Desert Renewal Foundation. "Ready to change the world?" she asked as we drove toward Phoenix. "Ready to try," I replied. The 18 months in federal prison had given me perspective on what really mattered in life and what was merely distraction. The financial success that had once driven my every decision now seemed less important than the opportunity to use my skills in service of something larger than profit margins and market share. The first year after my release was devoted to building the organizational infrastructure necessary to pursue environmental restoration projects. Sarah and I worked out of a small office in a converted warehouse, surrounded by grant applications, environmental assessments, and regulatory documents that would have overwhelmed most people but felt familiar to someone who had spent years navigating the complexities of waste management law. Marcus joined us 6 months after my release, initially handling administrative tasks but quickly demonstrating an aptitude for community outreach and stakeholder relations. His college education and professional experience, combined with his newfound appreciation for environmental work, made him an effective liaison with government agencies and community organizations. Our first major project was the restoration of a 10-acre brownfield site in South Phoenix that had been contaminated by a defunct battery manufacturing plant. The site had been abandoned for 15 years, becoming a neighborhood eyesore and potential health hazard for the families living nearby. The technical challenges were significant, involving soil contamination with heavy metals and other toxic substances that required specialized treatment before the land could be safely used for any purpose. But the regulatory and financial challenges were even more complex, requiring coordination between the EPA, state environmental agencies, the city of Phoenix, and multiple funding sources. The project took 2 years to complete, from initial site assessment through final certification that the land was safe for recreational use. The restored site became a community park with playgrounds, walking trails, and native plant gardens that demonstrated how contaminated land could be transformed into community assets. The success of the South Phoenix project led to additional opportunities throughout Arizona and neighboring states. A former copper mining site in Tucson that was converted into an educational center about desert ecology. A closed landfill in Flagstaff that was capped and converted into a solar energy installation that provided power to low-income housing developments. Each project reinforced my belief that environmental restoration could be both technically feasible and financially sustainable when properly planned and executed. More importantly, each project demonstrated that communities that had been written off by mainstream environmental organizations could benefit from innovative approaches to cleanup and restoration. The work was satisfying in ways that building Martinez Waste Solutions had never been. Instead of simply managing waste streams and maximizing profit margins, we were actually improving communities and demonstrating that environmental damage could be reversed through application of scientific knowledge and business acumen. But the most meaningful aspect of the work was the relationship it rebuilt between Marcus and me. Working together on these projects gave us shared goals and shared challenges that gradually healed the wounds created by years of misunderstanding and resentment. "I finally understand what you were trying to tell me," Marcus said one evening as we reviewed plans for a contaminated groundwater cleanup project in Casa Grande. "About the importance of work that actually matters, work that serves communities instead of just generating profit. You understand it because you're living it," I replied. Understanding and doing are different things. 5 years after my release from federal prison, the Desert Renewal Foundation had completed restoration projects at 37 sites across the Southwest, leveraging over $12 million in grants and contracts to transform contaminated properties into community resources. The foundation employed 18 people full-time, including environmental engineers, soil scientists, community organizers, and project managers who had been recruited from universities, government agencies, and private environmental consulting firms. We had also developed partnerships with major corporations seeking to offset their environmental impact through funding of restoration projects, creating a sustainable revenue model that didn't depend entirely on government grants or foundation funding. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had achieved greater financial success and community recognition through nonprofit environmental work than I ever had through my for-profit waste management business. The Desert Renewal Foundation's annual budget exceeded $2 million, and my salary as executive director was higher than anything I had paid myself during the early years of Martinez Waste Solutions. But more importantly, the work provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment that purely commercial success had never delivered. Each restored site represented a genuine contribution to community health and environmental quality, measurable improvements in the lives of people who had been forgotten by mainstream economic development. The recognition came gradually but steadily. Environmental awards from state and federal agencies, features in national magazines about innovative approaches to brownfield restoration, speaking invitations at conferences and universities where I could share what we had learned about combining business expertise with environmental restoration. The recognition was gratifying, but it was also a reminder of how dramatically my life had changed since that engagement party where Richard Ashworth had dismissed waste management as the bottom of the barrel. Richard himself had called me 2 years after my release, ostensibly to congratulate me on the foundation's work, but really to explore whether there might be opportunities for Ashworth Automotive to partner with us on environmental projects. "Rosa, I've been following your work with the Desert Renewal Foundation," he said during a carefully scheduled phone call. "It's really impressive what you've accomplished." "Thank you, Richard," I was wondering if there might be opportunities for collaboration. Ashworth Automotive generates significant waste streams, and we're always looking for partners who can help us minimize our environmental impact. The conversation was surreal, a complete reversal of the dynamic that had existed between us 5 years earlier. Now Richard Ashworth was courting my expertise, seeking association with the environmental work that had grown out of the waste management business he had once dismissed. "I'm sure we could find ways to work together," I replied diplomatically, "though our focus is primarily on restoration projects rather than ongoing waste management services." "Of course, but perhaps there might be opportunities for Ashworth to sponsor some of your restoration work as part of our corporate social responsibility initiatives." Richard's offer was genuine, but it was also a reminder of how business relationships could be transformed by changing circumstances. The man who had once seen waste management as beneath his notice now wanted to associate his company with environmental restoration work that had grown directly out of waste management expertise. I accepted his offer to sponsor a contaminated site cleanup in Scottsdale, partly because the funding would enable important environmental work, and partly because the partnership represented a satisfying conclusion to the conflict that had begun at Marcus's engagement party. The site was a former gas station where underground storage tanks had leaked petroleum products into the soil and groundwater for decades. The cleanup required sophisticated treatment technologies and careful coordination with regulatory agencies, exactly the kind of complex project that demonstrated the technical expertise required for successful environmental restoration. Richard attended the project completion ceremony, standing beside me as we unveiled a plaque recognizing Ashworth Automotive's sponsorship of the restoration work. "You know," he said as photographers documented the event, "I never really understood what you did until I started learning about environmental restoration, the technical complexity, the regulatory requirements, the community coordination. It's incredibly sophisticated work." "It always was," I replied. "You just weren't paying attention." The comment was pointed but not hostile, a reminder of our history without dwelling on past grievances. "I'm paying attention now," Richard said, "and I want you to know that I deeply regret the things I said at that engagement party. I was wrong about your industry and wrong about you personally. We were all wrong about a lot of things back then." The acknowledgement felt appropriate and complete, a recognition that the conflict between us had been based on misunderstandings and assumptions that experience had corrected. Marcus, now 33 and serving as the Foundation's Director of Community Relations, watched our interaction with obvious satisfaction. The woman his future father-in-law had dismissed as human garbage was now being courted as an environmental expert and community leader. "Mom," he said as we drove home from the ceremony, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't terminated the Ashworth contract? If you had just accepted Richard's apology and continued the business relationship?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I think everything worked out the way it was supposed to." "How can you say that? You went to federal prison, you lost your business. Your life was completely disrupted. And I discovered work that actually matters. I learned the difference between making money and making a difference. I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect instead of guilt and obligation." Marcus was quiet for several miles, processing the implications of what I had said. "So you're glad you went to prison?" "I'm glad I learned the lessons that prison taught me, about what really matters in life, about the importance of integrity over profit, about the possibility of redemption through service to others. Even if you could go back and make different choices, avoid the criminal charges, keep Martinez Waste Solutions?" Especially then. The person who built Martinez Waste Solutions was focused on survival and financial success. The person who built the Desert Renewal Foundation is focused on legacy and community impact. I prefer who I became to who I was. The conversation continued as we drove through the desert landscape that had become the setting for my transformed life. The mountains remained unchanged, eternal monuments to the geological forces that had shaped this land long before humans arrived, and would continue shaping it long after we were gone. But the valley floor showed evidence of human activity everywhere. Cities and farms, mines and factories, roads and power lines, that represented both the creativity and the destructiveness of our species. The work of environmental restoration was really the work of healing, finding ways to repair the damage caused by previous generations, while creating foundations for more sustainable relationships between human communities and the natural systems that supported them. It was work that required technical expertise, business acumen, and community engagement, exactly the skills I had developed during my years in waste management. But it also required something more. A vision of what was possible when those skills were applied to purposes larger than personal enrichment. That vision had emerged from the lowest point of my life, when criminal charges and federal prison had forced me to confront the consequences of choices I had made in desperation and ignorance. The woman who had been called human garbage had learned to transform actual garbage into community resources, to turn environmental liabilities into assets, to find redemption through service to the very communities that mainstream business often ignored. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.